In this episode, I want to discuss with you what I'm seeing in the 50-plus job market. I was on an Encore Network call the other day, and two of us were asked for our views of the 50-plus job market. I want to discuss how I view the world in August of 2023 and take you through 4 examples of recent successes from members from the Career Pivot membership community. Cue the music.
Welcome to the Repurpose Your Career podcast, brought to you by Career Pivot. This podcast is where those of us in the second half of life come together to discuss how to repurpose our careers for the 21st century. Come listen to career experts give you proven strategies. Listen to people like you tell their stories on how they repurpose their careers. And finally, get your questions answered. Your host, Mark Miller, has made 6 career pivots over the last 30 years. He understands this is not about jumping out of the frying pan into a fire, but rather to create a plan where you make clear, actionable steps or pivots to a better future career. Are you ready to repurpose your career?
Welcome to episode 333 of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. My name is Mark Miller, and I'll be your host every Monday for discussion on what it's like to repurpose your career. In this episode, I want to discuss with you what I'm seeing in the 50-plus job market. I was on an Encore Network call the other day, and two of us were asked for our views of the 50-plus job market. I want to discuss how I view the world in August of 2023 and take you through 4 examples of recent successes from members from the Career Pivot membership community. This will be a short episode, and I'm going to skip all the normal announcements, and let's just dive into it. I am part of Encore Network, which is encorenetwork.org, and I was asked to speak on what I was seeing. Another gentleman was asked to speak about the broader economic data. I know a lot of the listeners of this podcast are career coaches, resume writers, or provide other services in helping people with their careers. I want you to check out the Encore Network. The Encore Network is a coalition of leaders who champion the civic, social, and economic contributions of people 50 plus by creating community, stimulating learning, and inspiring action to transform the encore stage of life. Believe it or not, the economic numbers are pretty good. Yes, inflation has stretched a lot of you financially, but it's coming down. The big companies of the tech sector have been laying off, but the tech sector is actually a pretty small part of the overall economy. I will tell you that the green energy sector is hiring. A lot of money has been flowing into that sector after the Inflation Reduction Act passed. The official unemployment rate for those 50 to 54 and 55 plus is below 2.5%. Yes, I know that's probably actually higher than that, but that's down a lot from where it's been. And I will link in the show notes the latest press release from nifty50s.com with the data. By the way, Nifty 50s is another member of the Encore Network. I run the Career Pivot community, which is the sponsor of this podcast, which has right now about 40 people currently participating with an average age of somewhere around 60. And over the last 6 months, I have seen a lot of success. I discuss some of the successes that these folks are having getting hired during the Encore Network discussion. I want to highlight what I talked about. These are folks mostly in their mid to late 50s, and they're getting hired, and I want to take you briefly through their stories. By the way, all the names have been changed to protect the innocents. That's my dragnet metaphor. The first person I'll call Stephanie. She was laid off from the aerospace industry prior to the pandemic and freelanced as a mechanical engineer and a planer board designer for several years, but was not very successful. She tried being a web designer and got into real estate, and nothing was really working. She listened to episode 274 of this podcast, The Secret to Success to Staying Employed in Technology into Your 70s. This was an interview I did with Mike McNatt about how he stayed employed as a contract tech worker, and Mike's in his 70s. So she followed the roadmap that Mike laid out, which was all about building up relationships with contract recruiters. Following that roadmap, she landed a 9-month contract gig as a PCB design layout engineer. And by the way, PCB stands for printed circuit board. What this did for her is it refreshed her skills. And I like to say kind of took the unemployed logo off her forehead. She then reached out to several former colleagues and asked for AIR. And AIR is my acronym for Advice, Insights, and Recommendations. By the way, when you ask for advice, people rarely turn you down. Very quickly, she was interviewing and was hired as a senior design engineer and is now working remotely. That all happened really fast, and she was really surprised. Just getting that 9-month gig really helped. Next, I have Sarah, who was an engineering manager at a major tech firm. Sarah volunteered for a layoff as the company was going through major restructuring. She received a few months severance and was soon hitting the job boards, but she wanted to do something different with her leadership skills. And she did not want to manage people anymore and wanted more of an operations role. Applying on the job boards got her nowhere. We kept encouraging her to reach out to her network, which she was reluctant to do. Finally, I'm not sure how it all worked out, but she reached out to an old boss, or the old boss reached out to her and she told him what was going on. He was working as a consultant for a company that had several openings. He referred her to the hiring managers, and a couple of months later, she is now working remotely for this company in a product management role. She's an individual contributor, does not want to manage direct reports. And this is one of the interesting ones. Taking the time off gave her time to reflect on what she wanted to do, but more importantly, what she didn't want to do anymore. I now want to tell you about Mike. Mike had a long history in the technology product marketing. When his last job came to an end, he wanted to get into something completely different. He tried various forms of real estate development, but none of that worked out. During the pandemic, he was managing his mother's affairs, who was in a memory care unit. I cannot tell you the sorry stories that Mike told us about his mother, but it was not a pretty situation, and it was pretty damn stressful. While Mike's mom finally passed away, he spent over a year settling the estate. Mike learned a lot about elder care in her final years. At this point, he was pretty beat up emotionally. He had started his own marketing consulting business, but that wasn't going very well. We had been encouraging him just to go get a job. That would help his mental attitude a lot. Well, he had several friends gently nudge him towards a healthcare navigator position, where he will get to help seniors navigate a variety of technologies. His friends referred him to the hiring manager, and he's back at work. Now, sometimes you just need that nudge. And it took nudging from both the online community, but also from other friends, and he was getting the same thing from both of us. The last story I want to tell you about is Jack. Jack's in his late 50s. And was working as a communications manager for an association. He'd been there for well over a decade. The organization just hired a new CEO, and that new CEO fired his boss, who he liked a lot. He was not happy about the situation, but again, he hadn't been happy for a while. We'd been encouraging him to get out and network with past colleagues. This was primarily meeting people for coffee one-on-one. He had taken up meditation. He had really calmed himself, which, by the way, made it much easier for him to go reach out and go find it, to make the move. He was pointed to a position at a major financial firm to be a content creator. They were looking for people who did not have a financial background. Jack went through a series of interviews, and as I record this episode, he has accepted the position, turned in his resignation, and is going to take some time off before he starts a new job. He, like Sarah, will not be managing people. So what do you hear in the common themes? Well, it's like real estate. Location, location, location. This is relationships, relationships, relationships. It's also being flexible. I've had other members of the community who, like Stephanie, had to take interim jobs to get where they wanted. There's a lot of work out there. You may not be able to return what you did before. As with Sarah and Jack, they did not want to manage people, but wanted to do something different. I am seeing those that cannot find work is because they have a fixed view of the world. Sometimes what you want is not available for a whole variety of reasons. And some of you will think it is not fair. Well, tough. The world is not always a nice place. There is work out there. Companies are hiring people our age for good jobs. Not every company, but it is happening. Key piece, I cannot emphasize this enough. You need to work your network. And more importantly, I want you to really think about networking with younger people. Because I've written before, and I'll include the link in the show notes, I wrote a blog post about your network aging out, which happens to a lot of us. Sometimes you need help and a little nudging to do things you need to do to be successful. I hope you found that encouraging. Take a moment, go to careerpivot.com and sign up for the weekly Career Pivot Insights newsletter, which is sent out every Sunday. You'll get a weekly update on this podcast, white papers, and new blog posts. When you subscribe, you'll receive my latest white paper, Ageism, the Last Acceptable Bias. While there, do not forget to check out the Career Pivot community, which can be found at careerpivot.com/community. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. Thank you for listening all the way to the end of the Repurpose Your Career podcast. You will find all the show notes at careerpivot.com/episode-333. You can also subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Podbean, Overcast, Spotify, Pandora, Amazon Music, and lots of other places where podcasts can be found. In fact, this podcast can be found on the Repurpose Your Career podcast channel on YouTube. Hope to see you next Monday for another episode of Repurpose Your Career podcast.